Janice B. Gordon and welcome to The Business Show. Hello, this is The Business Show and I'm Janice B. Gordon. I'm speaking to Rebecca Stevens, MBE. Rebecca inspires people. She inspires people with not only the way that she's lived her life and the things that she's done, but also the speaking engagement and the leadership training that she does. So welcome, Rebecca.
Thank you, it's good to be here.
I'd like to know more about really how it all began. You are the first British woman to climb Everest, and I've read lots about you, so really I'd like to know what inspired you.
Well, you know, for about 27 years I was wandering around the world in a period of exploration, not knowing what I wanted to do, and I found myself in the Himalayas by invitation. I went there as a journalist to write about an expedition, surrounded by people who were completely passionate about climbing this lump of rock, and I thought this was slightly bonkers. I didn't get it, to be honest, but they clearly were very keen to do this. And so in an effort to discover why, I climbed myself up onto the first camp on the northeast ridge and discovered it. I just found that it was one of the most exciting things I'd ever done. It was extremely exciting. It sort of, you know, every sense was alive, and I just loved it. I can't really say anything else, but I was just completely taken by it. And it was really that day, back in 1989, that I could say for the first time what I wanted to do, and that was to climb Everest. And that was, I say half the battle won. It was almost all the battle won. I mean, I didn't have any skills, I didn't have any experience, I didn't have anything but this will to do it. And that was the energizer, I think, to go off and start climbing and build up some experience and skills to go back and climb it, which I did actually 20 years ago. I can't quite believe it, but it was 1993, 20 years ago this year.
But you've then gone on to climb 7 other summits as well, haven't you?
Well, it was an obvious thing, having climbed Everest, to climb what's called now the 7 summits, the highest mountain on each of the 7 continents. And it was a wonderful excuse to do something I love to do. And Everest, in sequence, was sort of third in line, if you like. So I had another 4 to climb, which took me to Antarctica, to Western Papua, to South America. And, you know, climbing mountains isn't just about the top 3,000 feet or so, where at a certain altitude they're all snow-capped and, you know, I mean, they all have their own personality, but you're away from the culture of the countries that you're traveling through. And by going to these 7 very different places, I interacted and trekked and you know, really communed with people from all over the world, and that was part of the joy of it.
You've obviously learned a great deal from this experience, which you pass on to many other people. Now, tell me a bit more about your leadership program, the 7 Summits.
Yes, I didn't go out with the intent to learn like that. I went out, as I say, just because it was something I really wanted to do. But reflectively looking back, I think everybody learns a lot in what is quite an extreme environment. And when I'm talking to people, I wrote a book about it called The 7 Summits of Success, and I'm drawing the lessons from each of those mountains, which are pertinent to people's daily lives, because the backdrop is, yes, very different to people's working lives, but, you know, essentially who we are as humans and how we set out to achieve our goals, how we interact with others, how we work together, the obstacles, the risks, the decision-making. These are things which are universal. And the stories from the mountains are very engaging ways to talk about them, if I may. So I often work with organizational behaviorists who have more academic grounding in these, but together we come in and talk and open up conversations which both touch the intellectual and the emotional, because I'm a firm believer, actually, that emotionally and through experience is how we learn things. Now, in the classroom here, we're doing it through stories, but I also take people to the mountains. So recently, the last couple of years, I've been working with women from Erasmus University, international MBA students, and we've been doing leadership training on Kilimanjaro, which allows people to, you know, to touch every sense and to share an experience like that, which is out of the ordinary. It's, you know, away from the clutter of our daily lives, if I can put it like that. It means, you know, we're bombarded by so much information now, so it gives women that time. But the relationship building in it, and I think probably every person takes away very different things, but the universal thing is this sense of overcoming limitations and fear and achieving something and think, if I can do it on Kilimanjaro that night when it was freezing cold and I was terrified out of my skin, I can do it too in the workplace. So it allows people to move forward in a very real world.
I would imagine being on top of a mountain for a business leader, taking them out of their environment, they get some real insight. Can you give me an example of somebody that you've worked with that has really kind of changed the way that they've worked with when they've gone back into business?
Yes. I mean, the thing about the mountains is, the way I see it, it strips you bare of all the superficialities of life. So you're really only focused on what happens in your heart and in your head, and that interaction, of course, with other people. But the feedback that we receive from trips like this is phenomenal. I mean, there was one beautiful young woman who had been working in IT. I mean, she had a very successful career, but she was doing an MBA program, and she wrote to me afterwards, and she said, "I'm now working for a humanitarian organization." And I'm not saying one is better than the other, but for her, that was the right path. And she hadn't had the courage to take that step beforehand. And something just, triggered through that experience. And she was able to take a step that had previously felt quite scary, and realized her own true path and was able to do that. It's one example. I mean, all the time I'm talking to people who say, that really changed my life. And it doesn't have to be formulated. I mean, by focusing on leadership and looking at people's individual needs, yes, I think the results are better. But also just from taking treks, which I've done, to the Himalayas, and if you're 3 weeks away, you have the simplicity of walking every day, you're surrounded by an unusual but exquisitely beautiful environment quite often, but mostly it's this time. It's just a breath in busy lives that allow people to reflect and just step off that wheel for a while, which I do believe is getting harder and harder in our modern lives. And often unintentionally, things become very clear. The next step becomes very clear and allows action when people return.
Now, Rebecca, you were not the only woman. You may have been the first British woman, but you were not the only woman in your team. What I'd like to know is what you brought to the team as a woman in climbing up the mountains.
Which team are you talking about? Are you talking on Everest?
The Everest.
I was the only woman on that team.
Yes, but you were with men. So what did you bring to that team as a woman climbing?
I did find myself in an unusual position that I was the only woman on the team when we climbed 20 years ago on Everest. Did I bring anything to the team? I don't know. Maybe you have to ask the guys that. I mean, certainly one of the lessons for me from that was to be, again, true to yourself. I mean, I do feel very strongly about this. I think, so many working environments, traditional working environments, have been created by men, for men. I mean, it's different in different areas and different industries. I completely appreciate that. But there's been quite a lot of pressure on women sometimes to be something they're not, to fit into that. And the mountaineering world as well was a very male-oriented one. Less so now, but it was back then. And I mean, simple things like clothes. I mean, this is why I'm tall, because I wouldn't have been able to buy any clothes otherwise. I just wore the guy's stuff, and, when you're up there, you haven't washed for 3 weeks and all the rest of it, any sort of femininity just sort of falls by the wayside. But I was determinedly who I was. So, as an example, there was a certain amount of, playful rivalry amongst the guys, and they would be saying, it took me 4 hours 20 to get from Camp 1 to Camp 2 or something, and somebody would come in and say, I did it in 3 hours 50, and, I'd come in 10 hours later and say, I'm here. And
So it's mine's bigger than yours, kind of.
Well, I mean, my point was that I knew I had to keep the rhythm with nature and with myself, and I couldn't let that go out of step. And I think that's true in life as well. There's a sustainability you need, and you need to be able to look after yourself in that. And by trying to be something you're not, you're really fighting a battle you're not going to win. So understanding that and going with that is important. And of course, Everest, like life, is a marathon, it's not a sprint. So you have to maintain your strength over a period of time. And at the end of the day, at the end of the season, I was fortunate still in a position to have strength to go on. I mean, only just, I have to say. But there was that. And I think the other really key lesson for me was the relationships with others. I mean, I climbed on the 17th of May with Ang Pasang and Kami Cherry, 2 Sherpas, and without those guys, I would never, ever have done it. And so had I not had a relationship with them that, said to them, let's go, we know the chances are minuscule, we know the chances of getting to the top are probably less than 1 in 100, and the weather forecast is rubbish, everything was against us, but they still said, let's give it a crack. And had we not had a friendship by that stage, I don't think they would have bothered. And I think, things happen in business between people who have lines of trust, and we shouldn't overlook that. And again, in our modern society, when there's so many of us, the lack of trust by necessity when you're trying to get a mortgage or something like that cripples you. I mean, you get clogged down in all this paper. That if you can, at least in companies, try and remove that a bit and allow people to move forward, because they know they're going to do the job, they know they can trust somebody, they know that they've got common objectives that they're going to meet, then things happen very much more easily, and actually happen, whereas otherwise they don't happen.
Do you think that's what women bring to the boardroom, their ability to build relationships, to network, and the staying power?
That's a very good question, and I'm afraid the evidence doesn't necessarily suggest that. A work that Diane Beverlander is doing at Erasmus, who actually sponsored this trip out Kilimanjaro, suggests, if you look at the figures, that one of the problems with women in work is, there's huge generalizations, I'm clearly not talking for everybody, but sometimes the trust between women isn't what we would like it to be. And it's one of the things we're doing on Kilimanjaro, to create a situation where women they're only women in a way that, that they do learn to trust each other more. I mean, trust is absolutely key. No, I think what women bring to the boardroom is something quite different, and that is simply something different from what there is. You wouldn't want a board with all women, and you wouldn't want a board with all men. But when you have a mix and a diversity, then you have different ways of thinking, and there's less of a risk to have groupthink, which can be extremely dangerous. And I think today what companies need to be thinking about is the consequences of not having women on boards, because, if the Davis report is anything to go on, it suggests that if you have, 3 women on a board, rather than none at all, then actually the bottom line benefits enormously. So, I think we need to be looking at that, because it is different ideas, and having the confidence to put them forward, and not just to go along with what the other bloke thinks, to challenge and create an environment where that's allowed. And I think perhaps also by having that diversity, there is an argument that the risk too, perhaps, is less. The decisions are thought through more at length, and can be less risky.
Thank you very much for that. You know that we've spoken before, and I'm very much for the EU quota, that I think it should be implemented. I don't know what your view is.
No, I don't think it should be implemented. I'm not a fan of quotas. The reason being, I think you enforce something, put people into a situation where they might not naturally be, and then you take the quota away and it all falls away again. For me, if there were to be any legislation, it would be around the environment in which we work, because I think that is one of the major obstacles for women.
But my view is that unless you have a quota, then there isn't going to be a change of environment. And I think, I absolutely agree with you. It's an environmental change. Yes. But because it's a fact, there is the group think. My view is there's mistrust amongst women because they're so few. It's so difficult. But unless there is a change in mindset, and that has to be, unfortunately, a forced change, there isn't going to be a cultural change which is long-term.
Well, I would disagree with that again as well. I think there is a cultural shift. I know that the Cranfield figures at the moment show a bit of a stalling in terms of number of women on boards, but progress is never a straight line curve. I think personally I'm more carrot than stick, but I come back to the fact that if there were legislation and we really wanted to get things moving quicker, then it needs to be more fine-tuned. Just to say a quota without actually specifying that it's the environment that needs to change isn't going to do anything. Well, it will, but not for any long term. But, for me, the obstacles for women in the workplace, and we see it, we see lots of women graduates, actually more than men, but, at an age, often biology, often families, women fall away. And that's because it is very difficult sometimes to make a choice in some careers where, it is 10-hour days or nothing. Well, in my mind, this is ludicrous. Other countries do it, we can do it, where there's more flexibility. It's about product, not just hours at the desk. And it does allow people, not just women, I hasten to add, to run a family life alongside their working life. And that family can take all different forms. But let's not forget the children of the future. And, you know, that they're not an uncomfortable byproduct, they're very important. And perhaps we should be talking about that more as well. But until that structure is changed, then, you know, forcing people in quotas into a situation that's not going to work for them, to me, just seems short-termism, and it doesn't have any longevity to it. So, sorry if I meant to say that. I think it's environment that needs to change, and that can come from within companies, and it is coming from within companies. I'm working with one at the moment, and then there's, you know, the attitude of the women themselves, often a slight dip in confidence that they've been away from the workplace a bit, to reinforce that, and to be given, you know, some confidence from other people within the company as well that they are valued and can move forward.
That brings us round to the team building work that you do in leadership, really, and I would hope that that's one of the areas that you're working with in order to make sure that women are supportive of other women in the workplace.
Yes. Well, the biggest lesson for me from mountaineering was that, you know, nothing of any scale is done alone. I mean, I know that sounds so obvious, but when I look back at myself in my 20s, I was horribly independent, or at least I thought I was. I wasn't, of course. I interacted with, you know, colleagues and family, what have you. But Everest was a realization that, you know, without that team, it just wouldn't have happened. Yeah. And that's true in corporate life as well. You know, otherwise it wouldn't have millions of people in a corporation, or thousands of people anyway. So that is really key, and how we relate to other people and move collectively in the same direction is key. And I talk about 3 very old-fashioned values. I mean, respect and trust and openness, and not forgetting that. I mean, quite often, I mean, to me it seems incredibly obvious, but it can get squeezed out, and particularly under stress. So, you know, an awareness of that and working out under stress environment, which we're all living in now, is key to me.
Excellent. Thank you very much for that, Rebecca. It's been absolutely fascinating speaking to you and hearing your insights. So this is Janice B. Gordon from The Business Show.